Hey guys, in this video I'm just going to extrapolate on a brief thought ramble. I recently watched a CBP video on how people suffer from envy, which I'll link in the description. In that video, I believe he claimed envy is experienced towards things you can't possibly have, and that this is where things get really dark in terms of suffering. I think he mostly makes a valid argument, but not a totally sound one. Basically, I disagree with his premise. I don't agree with his way of distinguishing between envy and jealousy. To me, jealousy is about things you think you deserve, while envy is towards things you don't believe you deserve. And before he or anyone says I'm just nitpicking the definition, I think the implications of this slight change are important. I'm not sure if this is what he was intending, but it comes across as if he's implying the relevant suffering is only due to envy and not jealousy. This actually kind of hits on the inverse of his statement, so the points he made in that video aren't necessarily invalid, thus you can't flat out reject his logic. But due to the more sensitive nature of the topic, if that was the case, I think clarifying his meaning is still helpful for reducing the spread of delusion. There are two reasons why I think the line should be drawn at deservedness instead of potential. When you draw the line here, one, it's pretty clear that envious people are going to suffer. It's obvious because they can't even convince themselves they should have the thing they desire. In this case, I feel if it was by far the main takeaway I could extrapolate from CBP's video, it wouldn't warrant any criticism for me since the message of his video would just kind of be pointless and not something I'd find misleading. The second reason is more fundamentally about responsibility and the nature of suffering. One of, if not the biggest reasons I think incels clash with the rest of society is because of where blame is pointed. I should clarify, when I say incels, I don't mean people who fit the literal definition, but the current overarching sentiment of related quote-unquote communities. And I'm not claiming the only reason for incel suffering is jealousy or envy. Anyways, for example, one of the most common counter-arguments against the incel perspective raised by society is that incels don't deserve the partners they're pursuing, thus their anger isn't reasonably justified. How much this counter-argument holds is debatable. Like, I'm inclined to believe Face and LMS's claims to have pursued partners society would most likely deem deserved based on what seems to be consistent support for people escaping inceldom and willingness to accept at face value sometimes unbelievable claims made by people with dissenting opinions, showing a lack of both jealousy and envy. While I'm inclined to disbelieve incels that immediately jump to posturing or beta bucks as justification for any relationships between disproportionately attractive partners while simping for a very narrow spectrum of physical appearances, implying the opposite. The inverse of CBP's message, that jealousy leads to not the same type of suffering described in his video, is pretty dangerous given his premise, since we rely heavily on symptoms to help identify underlying causes. Again, to clarify, I don't think CBP explicitly claimed the inverse, but due to logic being difficult, especially with emotional topics, it's pretty easy to imagine someone watching his video and resonating with the type of suffering described, then concluding the cause of suffering must be from wanting something unachievable due to uncontrollable factors, and throwing potential agency or responsibility out the window while blaming fate or society. On the other hand, if the distinguishing characteristic is self-belief of deservedness, people who suffer from envy become a radical and unlikely audience. It's even difficult to think of a clear example without being hyperbolic, like someone suffering because they don't own the planet Mars while watching aliens colonize it or something. Unless your name is Elon Musk, I'm pretty confident you don't believe you deserve to own Mars, and even in his case, I'm not sure. Alternatively, people who suffer from jealousy have to determine if they've earned what they believe they deserve before sensibly concluding their feeling is reasonable. Much of the suffering I've seen described by incels is closely tied to feelings of betrayal by society or pursued partners. This flavor of betrayal can't exist without the concept of expectation, which is necessarily something that can be moderated intrinsically, even in the presence of flawed, overpowering extrinsic pressure through simple disbelief or difficult introspection. So even if the individual is not entirely to blame, they have the ability to curb the constitution of their suffering, or at least make sure they don't believe in a delusion by evaluating their desires and state of being. Short tangent, this distinction even provides conditional jealousy as a potential explanation for society's counterargument. Under the assumption that society believes incels want what they don't deserve, a concession to the incel perspective would then imply societal members who evaluate themselves as more desirable than incels should also deserve what they think incels want, which would be a mess society absolutely would not want to deal with, meaning no concession can be made. It predicts that society can't fundamentally accept incel culture, including all the nonsense labeled as red pill today, but can accept both the red and black pill as philosophy in isolation. For example, despite having almost literally identical talking points with visually interchangeable presentations, the comments on QOVES School of Instagram is full of what appears to be grateful neurotypical women, while the comments for Face and LMS or Incel TV is full of what appears to be frustrated atypical men. In any case, to finish off this ramble, aside from my opinions on jealousy versus envy and CBP's specific video, I'd like to zoom out and trigger myself a bit by criticizing more abstractly the archetype that CBP and other people like Coach Red Pill and myself in the future portray. Even though this next part follows from criticizing a CBP video, I can't say if it applies to him specifically since I haven't seen enough of his content. I often hear people talking about what pill they ascribe to, or showing timelines between the black and blue pill saying they fall somewhere in between. For the advice-giving archetype in question, implying you fall at any specific point on the spectrum makes absolutely no sense. It's like a physician only ever prescribing one family of treatments no matter what problems their patients have. Like, I don't know if people realize this, but it's one of the fundamental differences between modern medicine and previous eras where we had like magic shamans and interior designers that majored in feng shui making decisions about people's health. Because these pseudo-health experts had basically no reliable method of diagnosis, a patient had to effectively self-identify what their condition was, then find the witch doctor that'd give them the brand of treatment they need, or just pray and hope they guessed right. The responsibility of clinicians is to prescribe treatments based on what their patients need, not to identify new diseases or formulate treatments. If your main goal is to give advice on YouTube, you're principally a clinician. If you want to come up with new advice for known problems that could be given, you're a drug company, and if you're trying to figure out why people might be suffering, you're the CDC. Okay, this analogy isn't exact. Research compilation channels like Face and LMS or Incel TV don't fit, but at the risk of sounding like your sister's dad, taking on multiple roles should probably come with some consideration for the responsibilities of every role taken. For example, my series has primarily been about identifying the causes for incel-related suffering, evaluating existing advice, and coming up with new advice that could be given. I try to be careful qualifying the underlying issues I've identified, staying consistent in my analysis, and justifying the solutions I've constructed in abstract. In the case I do make suggestions, which I can't remember if I did, I try to describe who my advice would work for or what problems my advice could alleviate, or defer to experts operating in a relevant field of study backed by a system of reasoning I don't feel has issues. One reason the pharmaceutical industry was split into agents with differing responsibilities was to avoid the exact problem we see with people like Coach Red Pill, dating coaches, and to some extent Jordan Peterson. They prescribe their solutions to people with mismatched problems or tilt people that are normally functional into believing they have problems through under-specific distribution in a conflict of interest that's probably monetary or clout-based. These modern life coaches or e-dads are unfortunately similar to the voodoo gurus of the past, and it's frustrating to see the influence their ideas have today. Anyways, I'm done ranting. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next one.